Hello and welcome back to the Core of Everything. Today, our guest is Professor Brendan Buckley of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. Brendan is a pioneer of using tree rings to understand past climates, or dendrochronology. He is a longtime member of the Tree Ring Laboratory at Lamont, which is celebrating its 50th year anniversary this year. In this episode, we discuss how he uses tree rings to understand past climates and how they correlate with the rise and fall of civilizations. As always, follow us on Instagram at CoePod, that's COE pod, or Twitter, X at the CoePod, COE pod. Enjoy the episode. The first question I want to ask you really is what do tree rings tell us, and what properties of tree rings do you use to tell us about sort of climate change and to past temperatures?
That's a great broad question because it's not a really one answer for anything. We use a lot of different parameters of tree rings, but traditionally what we use is the distance of one growth ring to the next, how long a ring is, how wide it is, or how narrow it is. And that's the simple answer because as you can imagine, if you take the geometry of a stem and you add a same volume of wood every year to that stem, it'll naturally decline in width as you go along just because of geometry, right? It's a whole new tree put on the old tree every year. So we have to work with that statistically to sort of filter out what we call the biological growth trend. And all that means is if you were to plot it on an XY axis, you'd come out with roughly a negative exponential decay to that curve. So all things being equal, the same exact volume of wood every year, the ring's going to get narrower and narrower with a sort of decline.
So as the tree ring grows, the width of the ring decreases in size. When does so the stem is also a trunk, right?
Yes, yeah, we've heard the trunk or the stem or the bole, BOLE. That's another word that's used by
Okay,
foresters.
okay,
Just to
and
confuse people, we like to throw in things,
just
identify outsiders, right?
yeah, let's isolate the enthusiasts. Yeah,
Yeah.
um, no, for sure. Okay, so we have tree ring number, and what is the resolution of tree rings? I know as you when I'm young, you get told one tree ring per year, and
Yeah.
that's how you age a tree. Is it generally that's the resolution?
It is. It's actually, as it turns out, we can do better than annual. But the typical thing is we have one ring and it's formed in one year, and then that year is, we assign the exact calendar date by this process called cross dating, which varies in difficulty depending on where you are in the world. If you're in the tropics, it can be quite challenging because you probably picked up from my talk the idea that rings can be missing on a part of the stem. And there's a whole host of interesting reasons why that's the case. But in essence, at its simplest form, there's one ring that's formed in every year. And once you've accounted for it and identified it correctly and given it its calendar year, all of the trees will have the same pattern in that year relative to each other, with some variations because there's minor differences in site where the tree is or if there's stand dynamics effects going on. But what we use is that external imprint of climate that's controlling how wide or narrow the ring is in every year. They'll uniformly vary across all trees within a broad region. So that if it's a poor year, it was a drought year, let's say, all the rings will be narrow that year relative to the rings around it.
Right. Okay. So it's climate that controls the ring development.
In theory, yes.
Okay. So that's seasons as well, or is that just the climate and droughts and monsoons?
So that's a great question, and again, it's dependent on where you are in the world, because different tree species will actually respond to climate in different ways depending on their evolution, whether they're an angiosperm, like one of the flowering plants, or whether they're the older form of conifers. If they're a descendant of the conifers, it's a simpler anatomy and it's a simpler way they respond. The angiosperms can be quite complex. We don't use them as often for the long tree ring records because of that complexity. And also the oldest living trees tend to be the conifers, the ones we used in Tasmania, the Huon pine, or some of these other conifer trees, the pines and so forth. They tend to live a long time.
Does that mean that so you can use obviously in your talk you mentioned that you've used tree rings to understand past stream flows,
Right.
volcanic eruptions, earthquakes,
Yeah.
well, like landslides, I guess.
Yeah.
But does that mean then there are different species of trees that tell you different things? Like, is a pine good for floods? Is an oak good for earthquakes?
Okay, so that's getting into the weeds of this because partially it's the species. So some species are really good at certain things for us, if we're looking at climate, but it's more likely to be reflective of where they're located. I'll give you a great example. If you have a group of pine trees growing in the American Southwest, let's say on the mountaintops of Arizona or New Mexico, they're very drought limited because water is the limiting factor there. And if they're on the south facing slope, which is the direct contact with the sun's most vertical rays in the northern hemisphere summer, they're going to be even more drought stressed. The lower you go, the farther away from the cloud areas, the condensation zone, the more drought stressed they're going to be, to the point where maybe it's even hard to cross date them because they'll be so stressed that they'll be missing a lot of rings in places. We can go into that later. But it's probably more a matter of where they're located. And if you're in the middle of a wet rainforest, and you have like 100 different species growing together, there's a lot of competing signals that are taking place. So the trees are less likely to reflect the general terms of climate, as they would be in an area like the Southwest, which you're simplifying a lot of what's going on ecologically, if that makes sense. You can picture trees that are growing, they're widely spaced apart, so there's not really a lot of competition between trees, and there's probably one or two species that grow together because the environment's harsh. Those trees are a lot easier to work with than going to the forests of Vietnam and having 140 species all mingled together. And they're all different canopy dominant stages. And then when the imprint of climate is what we're trying to recognize in the growth ring patterns, you'll end up with something that's reflected more of stand dynamics. So trees falling or overshading another tree, that'll affect the phyto periodicity of what the tree is going through. It's kind of like envisioning hand-to-hand combat in the forest. And there's a lot of other competing signals. In saying that, though, we can find certain tree species that are so strongly linked to the external imprint of climate that in spite of all of that competition, they still reflect the climate in a way that makes it possible for us to reconstruct climate. And one thing you just said I thought was really interesting about, I mentioned that we could do stream flow reconstructions or volcanic eruptions or look at earthquake events. And the reason is because we're looking at different aspects of the way trees respond to the external stimulus. And I'll give you one example. On the San Andreas Fault or any transform fault, we have lateral movement, transform movement of a fault, so it's sliding against each other rather than moving up or down. That can shear the roots of trees growing right near the trace of the fault and snap the tops off so that it's reflected in the ring pattern. That's what we use for looking at that type of movement. In the case of subduction fault zones, like we had in Seattle, I mentioned that in my talk, where you had subduction earthquakes that are really very deep, and you'll have a big drop of land. Landslides slid whole forests of trees into the lake. In this case, we're looking at Lake Mercer in Seattle, and so the trees are all killed at the same time on that landslide. And we know this because when we went to the bottom of the lake and got the samples of the trees with the bark still intact, we could identify the exact year that they all died. So that's a different mechanism. And within that forest of those trees that are under the water that were all killed at the same time, you see religiously recorded in there or faithfully recorded is the pattern of climate in the Northwest that was superimposed on top of that. So we could then use those trees for climate reconstruction, even though they were all killed at the same time, for looking at something that took place prior to the earthquake.
Gosh. So okay, so in the case of the rainforest, it seems that so many high complexities depending on which trees are better suited to monitoring climate, and some of them are just, I don't know, overshadowed almost or outcompeted, I think is the word you might have used. I
Yeah.
want to hear more about the San Andreas Fault. So as the two plates slide against each other, they're shearing, and these
Yeah.
shear the roots of the trees, and you can see these shearing events that cause earthquakes and stuff in the tree record.
Yeah, so when I started working at the lab at Lamont back in 1989, Gordon Jacoby was working on the San Andreas Fault. And near Los Angeles, I think it was Wrightwood Canyon, that he and Paul Shepard had identified a prior quake that no one had known about. And it was because they had this one, I think it was a white fir tree that was growing along right on the fault, like within a few meters of the trace of the fault. And the roots were ripped in half. And also, the trees that were large enough were shaken so severely from fault movement that it broke the tops off. So they lost photosynthetic surface and that was reflected in the growth rings. We have a beautiful sample of one on the wall in the tree ring lab. If you come by, I'll show it to you sometime.
I will do.
If all things work well, and in that case it did, you were able to identify prior movements of the fault because you go even 10 meters away from the trace of the fault that you're looking at. The trees are control trees that don't show the same impact. So it's very, very localized to the movement of the fault, unless there was a lot of peripheral movement of the land on top of that that might have been reflected there. It's really localized to within a few meters of the fault itself because it's more to do with the roots being sheared and ripped in half and the tops of the trees being snapped off. And when you get a little ways away, let's say within a quarter of a mile or so, you don't see that effect on the trees. That's how we're able to use that. Now, when I started working with Gordon, we were working in Northern California. He wanted to extend up by Gualala area, north of San Francisco. And it was mainly coast redwood that were on the fault there. And it turns out that coast redwood are really such a weed. I call them a weed. They're gorgeous trees. I love them, but they're all connected to each other. So that when they lose photosynthetic surface, they're using the photosynthates from the trees that they're all around them. So they're mostly coppiced and connected. So they were impervious to the effect of the fault unless, there was one tree that we found that had the 1906 quake on a place called Plantation Ranch. There was a big sequoia that was photographed at the time that had been ripped in half. It was still straddling the fault, but the tree was split. And you could see where it was offset by half a meter or so. We cored that tree. It was still living in the late 80s or early 90s, I think, by the time we went there. And we couldn't really find the effect of the earthquake that we knew had photographic evidence. We could see with our own eyes the tree was ripped in half. So the redwood were not the best tree to use for that because of their ability to survive these things by using the photosynthase from all the trees around them. They'll actually survive even if they've been logged and cut like in the 1890s. In some cases, we could find the stumps, and the tree had continued to grow stem wood on top of that cut stump, even though it had no leaves on its own tree. It was using the photosynthase from around it and was building up its stem still in spite of the lack of a top of the tree. So that's what that species is capable of doing.
They use the species of trees around them as sort of medicine.
Yeah. Yeah, well, their own species. So they're all connected. The redwood trees will all be connected to each other. It's kind of an interesting story on how they get that way. But yeah, they're all using. And then of course, someone asked me, one of my students, well, what's the invest? Why would the tree continue to invest in growing that stump? It is because the apparatus of getting to the roots that extend from that trunk to get to water and to nutrients are usable by all the other trees. So of course they continue to invest in creating that apparatus because it's still useful to the tree.
Is it more the tree is asking for help, or is it the other trees are providing aid?
We'll never know unless we can talk to them better. But I think that, because they are all connected, they're kind of one organism in a way. And there is communication going on between them and however they're doing it, and they're allocating resource because that's what the trees do. They're a factory of photosynthesis, and they create these carbohydrate chains that can be quite complex, and they distribute them to serve different functions. And its main functions are reproduction. Obviously, photosynthesis is super important, and this radial stem growth is kind of, I always look at it as like the savings account. It's sort of the last resource that needs to be spent. It's not critical that the tree continues to grow its stem outward. It needs to get higher to get to light, but it's not really that critical that it gets, grows outward. So that's sort of excess resource that'll allocate there when it can. And that's why we see the narrow and wide rings. So in a poor year, resources allocated elsewhere. Otherwise, if it were that important, the rings would be very, very uniform. So it really is almost excess energy that the tree has to spend, and it puts it in, I refer to as a savings account.
Yes. You did mention on the talk that you're best known for your work filling in the Southeast Asian tree ring records. And one of the trees you said had 51 rings missing on one tree's radius.
Yes.
51 rings. So I guess that's 51 years.
51 years missing out of about a 750-year
Okay.
expanse on that one side of the tree.
And that's to do with this resource allocation.
And if you happen to core through one of those areas, you can end up having a lot of rings missing. just from that mechanical part of the wedging. And on top of that, it's resource allocation. If in a poor year, you'll end up with a ring that's going to be narrow anyways, will now possibly be missing where you cored it. In getting back to that one tree, on the other sides of the tree, there was only 7 rings missing on another core from that same tree. So we were able to match the rings properly to where they belonged.
Mm.
Only because I take like 4 cores per every tree when I'm working in the tropics. I'll try to get 40 to 100 trees if I can.
Wow.
So we oversample them to make it possible to do the cross dating procedure to know where which ring is exactly the calendar year it belongs in.
Okay. And because there are tree rings missing in that one tree, does that mean they've allocated resources perhaps to another tree that's in need?
Well, I had never even thought of that before. That is conceivable. I don't know that the Phocania have the same. They're certainly not in the league of like redwood, coast redwood in doing that. So I don't know that that's true. That could be. That's an interesting, intriguing question. I don't know.
Just add me as a co-author as a paper, that's fine.
Yeah.
If you want. The one thing you said was about hormones, because trees have hormones, and one of the reasons why they have bare spots is because they didn't produce enough hormone, or
So again, it comes back to the energy allocation from the tree. There's this
okay,
growth hormone called auxin, and it's developed in the foliage. And so to initiate the cell division to start around the stem, when that time of the season comes around, it'll actually push the auxin down the stem through the conduits of fluid transport, in the phloem. And then from there, that'll trigger the cells to divide in the xylem area. So it's xylogenesis that takes place. So it's if you think about it, I have an analogy I use in my class because I'm very simplistic with the way I like to look at things. This is probably ecophysiologists probably hate this analogy, but I talk about the a hot fudge sundae. And if you have a thimble full of hot fudge and you pour it onto a pile of ice cream, it's going to leave a lot of bare spots. And if you have a gallon of it and dump it on, it'll cover the whole thing. And that's my simplistic brain thinking that if there's a lot of auxin that's developed because the resource was allocated to doing that, you'll get a good healthy ring formed around the stem. And that's back to the savings account concept, right? So how the tree spends its currency, which is photosynthase, it's carbohydrates, how it spends that is dependent on what's needed at the time. And they're quite clever with what they need and what they think about if they think. But how they go about spending their jelly beans is one of my friends referred to it as their sugars, the carbohydrates they
yeah,
produce.
there's a lot of analogies going on.
Yeah, I'm full of mixed metaphors. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. So if I were just to keep it nice and simple, I mean, one thing actually you referred to is density of tree rings. Is that the density in terms of composition, or is that the density in terms of just the amount of tree rings? What did you mean by density of a tree ring?
So when we started doing density, we figured out something that trees, and this was originated in the northern tree line areas where temperature is the most limiting factor. That we could measure the density of rings, meaning it was with X-ray, with soft X-ray. We would actually calculate this into grams of carbon per centimeter, per cubic centimeter. So it's a measure of the amount of material that's in there in the cellulose. And so it again, this is one of these things I'm going to grossly simplify it. So an ecophysiologist will be horrified listening to this. But in essence, what it is you're looking at the growth of the rings. And in a year that if it gets particularly cold at the end of the season, there's this really interesting phenomena that takes place that gives us the visible ring. When you look at a conifer growth, you'll see how the wood is very light at the beginning of the ring and it gets dark at the end. Now, dark band, we refer to that as late wood. So it's early wood and late wood is the way the basic construct that makes the ring. It's the early wood is that white wood and the late wood is the very dark wood. In some species, it'll look almost black or dark brown. And when we think of density historically, what we've always looked at is the late wood. Because what happens in the northern hemisphere or really anywhere where trees are at their temperature limits and the season's coming to a close, after they develop the cells, they've built the cellular structure by that auxin growth hormone that's developing. When it stops doing that, if the climate allows it to do it, it starts putting a compound called lignin into the cell and start thickening the cell wall. And it does that because lignin is extremely strong and it prevents the rupturing of the cell from freezing action. So the warmer the end of the growth season is, the more lignin the tree is able to put in, the more it's able to protect itself. And normally it's the end of the growth season and its cold temperatures are inhibiting lignification. In the case of the Vietnam conifers, it was the early wood growth that was being hampered by really excessively hot temperatures in a dry atmosphere, meaning vapor pressure deficit. The demand of water at the foliage was so high that the trees figured I better lignify these cells to protect from the cavitation process. And the reason why that matters, and I know this sounds probably a little more long-winded and complex, is if you can envision drinking through a soda straw, which is about 5 millimeters in diameter, or drinking through a snorkel, it's very hard to pull water through a snorkel the larger that diameter is. So you're more likely to break the tension in the water that you've created by putting suction in there. And that's exactly the process that takes place within the tree conduits. There's a demand of pulling water up through the stem, and if the lumen is too large and the volume in that tube is too great and the water amount is too little, you'll break that tension in the water and create what's called cavitation. And that's akin to an embolism. And you think about it, you put air in to interrupt that tension in the water, the hydraulic tension, and the trees don't like that. It's not good for them at all. And so we're able to use density in that way. I know that was a really long-winded
No, no,
explanation.
I think I get the concept. It's like a Goldilocks window of there needs to be a certain width, otherwise it's
Yeah.
ineffective either way.
And remember, the tree is allocating energy to do this. So it must sense that it's much like when trees, when they sense a die-off coming from, let's say, spruce budworm, they'll put a lot of energy into putting out a lot of seed. It's called mast seeding, M-A-S-T, seeding. And so this is usually a sign of this stress at the site. And you see this in the northern tree line a lot, where you'll see spruce trees will just have loads of cone. And then it's usually a sign that there's some sort of pest or something else that's affecting the trees. So they want to reproduce when they can. So they're putting all their energy into that possibility.
Wow.
They're quite fascinating and actually forward thinking when you put your mind.
That's made so in response to stress,
Yeah.
trees seed.
Yeah. Yeah. So they'll pump out, they'll put a lot. So again, I think of trees when I'm interpreting tree rings, I'm always thinking of what's the cost and what's the benefit. It's a cost benefit analysis for trees, whatever they do. They're putting energy somewhere. And if they didn't create a lot of energy that year because the climate was, let's say, too cold to photosynthesize regularly throughout their growing season, they have a lot less resource than they would in a really good year. And if they sense they're in the middle of a drought, though, they do a couple of interesting things that reflect in what we see under the microscope. And one of them is the development of false rings. You might have heard me mention them in my talk the other night. And a false ring is just that lignification process that's usually used at the end of the growth season to protect the tree from cavitation or frost damage. It starts to happen in the middle of the growth season if the drought gets too severe. Sometimes they look like a real ring boundary, and they'll throw off our cross dating if they exist severely enough at the location that you see them and they fool you into thinking it's a real ring. You'll actually count an extra ring in there that's not really there.
That's why you collect 200 samples when you go to a certain
If,
site, right?
if we can, if first of all, sometimes we're not allowed to.
Yeah.
People may not let us core that many trees, but sometimes you just don't find enough trees around to do that. And so, or they're so stressed, and there's many sites in Vietnam that I've looked at of that species that works so well, but they're growing on limestone in the karst areas, and they're so nutrient poor that the trees they put on maybe 5 to 7 cells per year, and I can't cross date them. They just there's not enough. There's way too much variance in what is present in my visual field that I just can't work with them.
Hmm. I mean, I've got so many questions now.
Bring them
Um,
on. Bring them on.
just you say when they seed in response to stress, do they seed in response to drought as well? And if they do, then that's if they're seeding in a drought period, that probably doesn't do very well for the plants themselves or the trees
That's a,
themselves, no?
that's a great question. I normally think of this mass seeding taking place when there's like like insect outbreak, like spruce budworm or something.
Mm.
I actually don't know about drought, and I suppose it would really depend on the species. So, some trees are serotinous, where their cones have to have fire, the presence of fire. And I'm not an ecophysiologist, so I don't know if they would respond to a drought in an area like that.
But it's
Assuming
interesting if
it
they
could be
it's
higher.
what's would be interesting if they didn't respond to droughts like that, which means that they've got enough intuition or they're smart enough to realize that this isn't the time to seed
Yeah.
because of
I
the poor conditions.
yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did. That's a great question. Now I need to know the answer to that question. You're on a couple papers with me now already.
Yeah, I'll be first author on
Yeah.
that one. Yeah. I've got so many questions, but we're running low on time. So I want to move on to your work specifically that looks at monsoons and droughts and how that's affected humans. And there was one thing you mentioned at your talk that you can identify the rise and fall of civilizations using tree rings.
Yeah, that was interesting. So what I was referring to there was we've named a drought the Strange Parallels drought. It was the drought that I saw in northwest Thailand in the 18th century. And Victor Lieberman had written a book. He was a historian out of Michigan, the University of Michigan. He wrote a really excellent book on it was called Strange Parallels. And he was looking at northern Eurasia and Southeast Asia and how the polities rose and fall, would rise and fall in correspondence with each other in those two regions. And he didn't have any hard data, but he hypothesized that it looked like something that suggested an ecological connection. And he hypothesized climate would be one such ecological thing. And so when I knew nothing about the history of Southeast Asia until I started looking for, was there a correlation to the droughts that I was seeing? Was there any reference to it in the chronicles that were mostly written from the Lana Kingdom in northern Thailand? And that's how I came across some of this historical information. And what you see is that in Victor's book, he shows a couple of different time periods that had really strong correspondence between northern Eurasia, like, Siberia, Mongolia, places up in the very northern part of Asia, to Southeast Asia. And it showed this rise and fall at exactly the time of the drought that I found in Southeast Asia. So that's why I thought, well, this is interesting. Is there a connection here? And then it showed also at the time of the Angkor Kingdom in the past, in the 14th and 15th century, there was correspondence there too between the rise and fall of polities. So that political instability was linked to each other in these two locations, and there was this thought of whether it was could be linked to climate. The tree ring records started to show that that was the case. So it's not that the tree rings are directly showing us anything to do with human reaction to climate, but we can see in the historical records that there are times where these physical connections of climate to things like flooding, for example, or massive drought can affect civilizations there. You have to be really cautious. The historians spanked me a little bit on this, is that there's not a causality directly many times because humans are really good at hedging their risk, where we tend to be kind of risk averse. So we'd build something like the Khmer did, those big borai at Angkor, that these big tanks of water that were really designed to help shunt water through the system because there was always an excess of water. But it also helped to mitigate the effects of drought when it happened. And then around the time of the what's considered the demise of the Angkor Kingdom, you'll see that we found in the tree records are two big whopping droughts. We call them Angkor droughts 1 and 2. And Angkor droughts 1 and 2 were sandwiching a big wet period in the middle, this pluvial that took place in the middle. And now these tanks, this whole system had been around for several centuries at that point. And what we saw in the archaeological record, working with Roland Fletcher and others, the late Damien Evans, who unfortunately passed away, but did some great work with LIDAR, we could see that there had been attempts to change the intake and outflow of those borai. Those huge tanks are many kilometers in size, in area in Angkor. First to take in more water in the time of drought, and then to frantically undo it because they were flooding. And the river, the water was jumping the walls and flooded the city where the Mabon is in Angkor Thom. So there's a really interesting story there of humans responding to the environment. And what we determined we published a paper in QSR on this subject in 2014, and it showed that it was probably the flooding events that was really the death knell to what was Angkor Thom and the area where people were living around that area around. We think of it as Angkor Wat, but it's really the inner city there and all the outlying areas. And we think it was the droughts that really did the damage. And people, there was never a complete vacation or vacating of the area, but pe people more or less moved to another location. And it was almost certainly related to the flooding that took place.
But the flooding events were exacerbated by the fact that humans were responding to the drought by trying to enhance water flow, I suppose, during drought periods, which made
That's
the
a
flooding period worse.
That's a great question. How much it mattered, I don't know. Because one thing about the Angkor Kingdom, there's very little written documentation of anything, and we don't find skeletal remains either of people. People were probably cremated, for certain. There's one account by a Chinese merchant that traveled to the area. That's one of the only written things that talk about that period of time. But we're looking at the archaeological record that the EFEO folks worked with and the group out of the University of Sydney, the Greater Angkor Project. So I worked with them on this couple of papers. So the story of Angkor is interesting. It's clearly has a climate linkage to it. And then it clearly has, I would say, aging infrastructure that no one was around who built it. And they really, no, there was this archaic infrastructure that at those times was made them vulnerable. Who's to say they would have been vulnerable without it, and whether what they did to it was the cause of their demise or not? I think they were reacting to it the best they could, but they clearly that climate period was tumultuous and it had an impact. We can say that much about it.
Okay. That was very scientific of
Oh,
you.
was they?
'Cause a journalist might say there could be a causality, and sort of be a bit more,
There could be, right?
yeah.
We were very reluctant to go there, as because I worked on some other things in northern Vietnam, and we find a few things in the written records. And sometimes it's the written records, let's say for Hanoi or Hue in northern Vietnam. Those are records. It turns out we can use the lunar eclipse record in there to pinpoint where the records were written from. And it turns out a lot of what we saw in those records were rewritten from China at different periods of time because the Chinese and Vietnamese were always battling with each other. So you'll see records that weren't really accurate to the location that they claimed to be from. So we had to be really careful with how we interpreted things. And what we do find that sometimes, usually if humans are going to have a direct response in almost immediate time to an environmental disaster, there's a mitigating factor for example, war. And in northern Vietnam, what we saw a lot of times was like during the Dai Viet Kingdom, there were times where warfare during the Tai Son Rebellion depleted the stocks of rice that had been stored because it was conscripted to the army. So people actually, there was famine because people didn't have rice that they would normally have had because it was taken for the army. And so that's a case where there is a much more causal effect to the effects of drought or to climate uh, because people weren't prepared for specific reasons. And normally we're humans are pretty good at protecting ourselves from events that we think are likely to happen. Where we get caught is when you look at periodicity of a long record of climate that we've produced from the tree rings the last 1,000 years, let's say. Big events like the Angkor droughts don't happen very often at all. And they've happened really a couple of times in the last 1,000 years only. And so they're not predictable. The 18th century drought is a little bit more predictable. Even that one is a fairly significant event. It's not linked to what's the normal climate variability that we see, like related directly to ENSO. It's probably something else. And so these shocks to the system that are unpredictable are the ones that really cause the response for humans. There was no way to see it coming. And when we're in that mode, you usually have trouble.
One thing you mentioned there was that the records go back 1,000 years. What are the some of the oldest tree rings that you've come across? How far can you go back, do you reckon?
There are records of continuous tree growth measurements from different parts of the world that cover the entire Holocene, like the last 10 to 12,000 years or so. That's very hard to do because usually the trees that existed back in the times where we needed to get there, they're either in an archaeological building or they're found in some sort of subterranean context, buried in lahar flows or in river sediments or something. So we can find old wood that we can piece together by cross-dating it if there's enough overlap. Personally, the records I worked on that were the oldest continuous records were from Tasmania. And we had one living tree that I mentioned it in my talk. I showed a picture of it from the Harmon River in Western Tasmania, a Lagerostrobus franklinii, the Huon pine. It was the oldest one anyone's ever found. It's a 3,000-year-old tree that was growing in the Harmon. And that's the oldest living tree that I ever cored. But we were able to piece together records from a nearby site from there that go back more than 4,000 years because there were living trees that were maybe 1,000 to 1,500 years old, and then trees that died in relative times in the past that got us back by connecting them 4,000 years. And before that, we know that the Huon pine had been up on Mount Reed for at least 10,000 years from the pollen record, but we just never found the wood that went back that far. Mostly it was ice
Wow.
abraded because we were at about 1,200 meters of elevation. And the trees just would get blasted by the prevailing westerlies, and the ice pellets would just abrade the wood. And the reason we found the old wood we did was because there were stumps available that we had been tripping over for a year before it occurred to us if we cut that, we go dig it up a little and cut the base of that stump, we will be getting older wood. And that's what we started doing.
Wow.
That same species in the low elevation, we have radiocarbon dead pieces of that wood and mostly a Holocene record because they preserve so well. But we have a gap in the middle of the Holocene.
So we're looking at almost fossilized wood that could create records for the whole Holocene, and petrified wood.
Petrified wood that you see is, where it's actually permineralized into, so it becomes that solid stone.
Yeah, I should probably say that's fossilized wood that's been transformed slowly into stone
Yeah.
because of precipitation of fluids moving
Yeah.
through it and creating crystals.
And what we refer to as wood that is subfossil, we call it, and that's wood that's been buried sometimes for many, many thousands of years, but you can still cut it with a chainsaw and it still
Yeah.
looks and smells like it's still wood. Um, that's mainly what we work with. So the really old stuff that you see like metasequoia, it's people have tried to use it for things. It's just so out of context, and usually there's metasequoia had massive rings, and there wasn't a lot of variability. It was a very hot, wet world they were growing in. So I don't know anyone who's gotten anything akin to what we do in the modern context with wood from that time.
There's
I do.
nothing there's nothing from the Carboniferous that's been preserved well enough to do tree ring
You actually
identification.
could. You could measure the rings in it. I've seen some samples that people have sent me. You could measure the rings. You could see the cellular structure in them. What I do know that like Kate Gregory was a woman that worked at Lamont many years ago, and she was interested, I believe, in looking at the comparison with modern redwood with metasequoia to look at maybe stomatal density on the leaves and other things that could show you how much what the carbon levels were at that time because there's a link there between the trees have ample carbon in a carbon-rich environment. They can be more conserving of water by having fewer holes, the apertures that they breathe through and exchange gas with the atmosphere. So there'll be the density of those holes, the little apertures will be less. It's called stomatal density.
Okay.
And so there's an interest in looking at that in the past. We know that it was a carbon-rich environment because the stomatal density was far less on trees at that time.
Didn't realize. But the oldest known tree is called Prometheus.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Prometheus tree is a bristlegone pine tree that's was in Nevada Peak, Wheeler Peak in Nevada in the Great Basin. It's now Great Basin National Park. That's the one that was cut down in 1964 by a grad student because he got his increment core stuck on it. The story goes, and he knew it was old, but no one would ever could have conceived that that will be the oldest living thing ever found. And it was a 5,000-year-old tree. I think it was more than 5,000 years, but the center was rotted out of it. And he did cut it down, and they pulled, I think, 4 or 5 slabs out of it and hauled it off the mountain. But
How did he feel? How could he?
I know, I assume that, when you became, I think he was, I don't know the story specifically. There's a lot of lore around it. People having heart attacks carrying the wood out. It makes nice stories. I don't know if it's true or not. But it is, that would be pretty hard to be tainted with that notion that you killed the oldest living thing ever found. And in his defense, he had no idea that that would have been the old. I mean, he knew it was old, but there were a lot of old trees up there, but no one's ever found one older.
It must have been incredibly thick, that tree.
Yeah, it was. I have a picture of it somewhere. I'll send it to you if I can find it.
Thanks, please. Yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
great.
Ed Cook was up. They found the tree up on Wheeler Peak, so it's known where it's located. Of course, it's dead now, but there's a gap in it. And you can see where the instrument core had been in and been removed from what was cut off of it. So it's still there, what's left of it, and it is a massive stem. It was those bristlecone pine that tend to grow. They look these gnarly old things growing up on that rocky terrain up there. They're beautiful trees.
It's extraordinary. 5,000 years.
Yeah.
Um, we've already we've done well over half an hour here at this point.
Yeah.
And I've just got one more question to ask you really, and that is, say I'm an amateur, I'm just a tree fanatic, but I'm a complete amateur, and I'm walking through a park and I see a tree stump. From what we've talked about, what can I look at and identify, and what can I tell from that tree just by looking at the tree rings?
The simplest thing that's the reason why dendrochronology captures people's imagination is because it's pretty easy to understand at its base level what it is that we do. You have an individual growth ring in every year, and you can tell how old something is. And which is a really kind of cool. You know how old that stump was when it got cut if the outside edge still exists. And then you can also look at if there's a lot of variability from one year to the next, you can know that if you know your region that this is either a very dry or a very cold year that's making that narrow ring. So there, at a first order, there are a few things that you could tell about it. And
And
then
color it seems as well, right? If it's been a warmer climate or a colder climate in the past.
if it's not weathered too much, you could be able to, like if you cut a new fresh surface on it, you can see the color of it. And if the tree's been scarred in any way, a lot of the trees I work with in Southeast Asia, the local populations of the nomadic folks that live up in the hills, they'll sometimes cut holes out of the pine trees. They just with an adze, they'll chop into it because they'll get the fat wood out of it for starting fires in the wet season. It's really, really wet in the monsoon. So they'll use this very flammable resin-filled wood to cut little strips of wood out in light fires that way. That's how they get their cooking fires going. And that shows up. So that's what we call culturally modified trees.
Hmm.
And you can actually tell the date of cutting. If someone went and cut a blaze on a tree like Lewis and Clark, when they marked an axe blaze on the tree, those are fixed in time and you can tell the date that they did it. You can tell whether they did it in the dormant season or in the middle of the growing season. You could come out to a pretty decent idea of what month that axe mark was made. And um,
Wow.
and that's always an interesting thing. And one last fun story on that was when I first started working with the group in Tucson at the Tree Lab, there was a story about the famous serial killer Ted Bundy who had been murdering women in the place in Utah, I think it was called Green River, and he had carved his initials in trees. And so part of the trial was determining whether the TB that was carved in the trees could be dated to the season to try to match it to the times when they knew this really macabre thing was taking place. And I don't know if they ever ended up using that at trial, but that was an interesting example of someone trying to use tree rings to do something that had greater use.
People use tree rings in the trial of Ted Bundy.
Yeah, as a forensic tool. And so there is a history of forensic use of dendrochronology. And that was probably the most colorful one I know. I don't think that data ever made it into the trial, but I know that people in Tucson were approached about that.
You can, from people when people put their love heart and their initials of the couple into a tree, you can tell what season they fell in love.
That's right. And then when they put when they crossed it out, you know when they fell out of love.
Yeah, exactly. Forensic analysis.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, Brendan, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been fantastic.
According to my wife, I can really crap on a little too long about things sometimes. So I apologize if I got long-winded. Feel free to edit any way you want.
Well, normally I don't edit at all, and I don't think I
Okay.
should because it's been really interesting. And I really appreciate it. Thank you.